So a while back, I did an episode on Iron Maidens, not the band, a stereotypical medieval torture device that was actually invented in the early 1800s as a way of showing how bloody and violent the medieval period was, as opposed to, the amazing industrial world of the early 19th century. And the Iron Maiden became iconic, and for many, it was a symbol of medieval torture devices. And that got me thinking about other purported medieval torture devices. What else is fake? Well, let's take a look at the scourge of womankind, the Pear of Anguish. When I moved from the UK to the US, I grew up not too far from the medieval times in Lyndhurst, New Jersey. It was close enough that we went there on school field trips or for birthday parties. I'm pretty sure I have a photo somewhere of a birthday party from my older brother in medieval times. I don't know, it was a while back. But the thing I remember the most was the Torture Museum. Because of course it was. And in trying to find pictures and evidence that the museum still exists, because I haven't been back there in a long time, I came across an article about it from Roadside America. And here's what they said about my cherished torture chamber. Quote, "The museum provides about 3 minutes of entertainment. The displays are half-baked torture tableaus featuring Halloween-grade decorative skeletons and lots of thick spray-on cobwebs. No attempt at accuracy or realism is made in the 3 small rooms that visitors traverse in single file. Mounted on the walls are torture instruments like the Pear." End quote. Oof, that's not a glowing review. But I do remember the Pear of Anguish at that museum, and it's been rattling around my head ever since. It's also appeared as a medieval torture device in TV shows like Criminal Minds, It's Been on Bones. You can even buy them online. Look at this fancy one from the 19th century, available for only 2,000 to 3,000 euro on auction. So let's do some research to find out if it ever existed as a medieval torture device, and if not, then when and why was it created? Let's start by looking at the device itself. The typical pear has 3 or 4 pieces that form a circular or pear-shaped ball. The pieces are then connected together at one end by a hinge, which can be forced open, like the world's worst speculum. As Chris Bishop of the Australian National University wrote in an article titled "The Pear of Anguish, Truth, Torture, and Dark Medievalism," quote, "It has been proposed that by inserting the device into different orifices and then gradually expanding it, medieval torturers could punish the wicked according to their crime. Thus, the pear, it is imagined, was forced into the mouth of the blasphemer or into a woman deemed guilty of witchcraft, adultery, prostitution, or of inducing a miscarriage." End quote. And he gives more examples of which orifices it might be used on, and is a little bit more straightforward with where it might be inserted, but I'm sure you get the picture. Use your imagination. But let's take a look at this thing. Now, if we take its modern-day description at face value, then this would have been shoved into, let's go with someone's mouth, purportedly as a form of punishment and torture, right? Well, if that's the case, then why are so many of them so ornate? And for something that's supposed to belong to the medieval period, and some even claim it was used during the Spanish Inquisition, the technology is wrong. Bishop notes in his article that the coiled springs that help make this device trigger open didn't exist until the 15th century. Importantly, he also notes that, quote, "It is clear that a latch at the tip of the pear can be triggered to release the spring-loaded lobes. This latch could not be released if the pear was already inserted into something or someone. The action of the spring once released, it is to be presumed, would not be a slow process, but rather a sudden one. The lobes are then gradually screwed back together by the use of an additional key. The device, therefore, screws closed rather than open." End quote. Interesting. So right off the bat, it eliminates the idea of being placed into, say, your mouth and sprung open, since the mechanism to do that can't be reached once it's in there. And then the screw at the end closes it, not opens it. So if it seems unlikely that this device was made in the medieval period, or that it's used for what we thought it was, then where did it come from? When was it first mentioned in literature? The earliest source we know of comes from François de Calvi's Histoire générale de l'Aron, or the General History of Thieves, published in the early 17th century, that's the 1600s. I found an English version, translated by a man named Paul Godwin from 1638, and look at this thing. I love early print like this. And for those of you interested in checking it out, I linked it in the sources in the description down below. Now, on page 137 of this source, at least page 137 of the online viewer I'm using to read it, the author translates the story of Paglioli and his choke pear. Here are some of the highlights, and I'll put the page on the screen as well so you can enjoy the English print books from the 17th century, before they had standardized spelling and used this letter for an S. Paglioli is a thief. And the story opens with an anecdote about him creating a pair of fake hands, which he brings to a church, sets them up to look like they're holding a Bible, and then kind of gets close to a woman with a nice watch on her wrist. The woman is suspicious and looks at him, but she sees him holding his Bible, so she just goes back to her devotionals. But when she turns away, Paglioli grabs her watch with his real hands, the fake ones still holding onto the Bible, and then he leaves. And this gives us an idea of his character. He's not a good guy. The next anecdote is about the pair. I'll read this one directly from the source. Quote, "Not long after, he goes to a smith of his acquaintance, a very skillful man in his trade, and one wholly at his beck, and gives him instruction how to make a kind of instrument in the likeness of a little bowl, which by the help of small springs within it might open and enlarge itself, so that being clapped into a man's mouth, it could not be removed without the key purposefully made to that end. He termed it a choke pear." And choke pear, historians believe, is another name for what later became the Pear of Anguish. The source continues with a story about Paglioli and some friends robbing a man named Aratus, who loved his money as his life, and nothing so well as his life but money, but loath to lose either, and fearing the laws of both. Quote, "Aratus began to cry for help, but at the instant, one of them, gripping him by the throat, made him so gape for breath that it was no hard matter for the other to give him the pear, which being entered, his mouth opened so wide that he was forced by reason of sharp points of iron which were on each side of the pear to gape as wide as possibly he could. Thus remained poor Aratus like a statue, not being able to speak a word or express his grief, but by signs while Paglioli robbed him." End quote. It goes on, but you get the point. The pear was shoved in this guy's mouth so he couldn't really do much but stand there as Paglioli and the other guys robbed him. And according to researchers like Chris Bishop, this is the first written source we have of anything even remotely close to the Pear of Anguish. And it's written in the 17th century. Certainly not the medieval world. The story then grows and is reprinted in different contexts in different places, and soon the pear becomes accepted as a real thing. And it didn't take long for people to start making some to sell to museums or collectors. Now, if you watched my mini on the Iron Maidens, I broke down how that wasn't real either, right? And I showed you a really cool pamphlet from the Earl of Shrewsbury's collection. And here it is again, and you can see the advertisement for the Iron Maiden right on the front. And as it turns out, a Pear of Anguish was in this same traveling torture museum. As Bishop notes, quote, "The 19th century fascination for medieval torture equipment led to a boom in the production of counterfeit items, but this trade did not finish there. By the turn of the 20th century, Pears of Anguish, no less than Iron Maidens, chastity belts, thumb screws, and racks, were in high demand. The machining, apparent on some museum pieces, readily betrays their recent manufacture." End quote. So much like the Iron Maiden, the Pear of Anguish was brought from print to reality, grossly exaggerated, and then attributed to the much more distant past. And none of that is really surprising to me. It doesn't seem like a real torture device. But I still have two unanswered questions. First, why, like the Iron Maiden, was the Pear of Anguish relegated to being a medieval torture weapon when the story clearly establishes it as a 17th century gag used by a thief? And second, if the device is meant to be used as a gag, and the way the object works gives away the fact that it's not really a torture device, then why do we associate it with all kinds of horrible things? Why did we collectively go the way of the Marquis de Sade with this one? Well, luckily for me, Bishop has answers to these two questions. For the first, why it was attributed to the medieval period when it's clearly not from there, he has this really great line in his article, quote, "The Middle Ages is a timescape in which any excess can be imagined, in which any cruelty might seem credible. That modern minds could construct such a violent history for this ambiguous artifact, and that modern audiences could so readily embrace this construct, demonstrates the powerful historical proclivity of dark medievalism." End quote. It's a pretty rad take. I mean, we do associate the word medieval with dark dungeons and torture and pain, blood, violence. So when collectors in the 19th century were stocking their museums with torture devices purportedly from the medieval period, things like the pear, which in all likeliness was never actually used outside of demonstrations in a museum hall, all of a sudden became horrible, torturous, bloody, violent machines, much like the Iron Maiden. Okay, then, second question. If this device was designed to be, and described in that story as, essentially a metal gag, why did I learn, as a small child in a torture museum in medieval times, that it was used on women in what could tamely be described as the world's worst OBGYN appointment? Well, the answer to that is probably why so many of us like horror and true crime. Once left up to the imagination, and our associations of it with the medieval torture devices, the pear, over time, became less of a fictional gag and more of an instrument of debauchery. How very medieval. So, in sum, the Pear of Anguish? If this device was actually used for something other than looking ghastly in a museum, it certainly wasn't used for torture. My name is Kelly Beard, and thank you for listening to this F-Out Mini on the authenticity of the Pear of Anguish. If you enjoyed this episode, go check out some of my other minis or my longer podcast episodes, which drop every other Sunday. Sources for this episode are in the description, and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on any more bloody, gross, mysterious, or weird stories from history.